It's the end of the year, my friends. A time of self-reflection, a time of new beginnings, and a time where we can all look back at ourselves as people and wonder if what we did in the last year was the right thing to do. If what other paths we took were the right ones.
I've made a severe and continuous lapse in my judgment.
I know I feel that way sometimes, and I know the path that I'm taking right now is one of a big risk. When it comes to YouTube, I'm relatively lucky. I get to spend my days making content for you all to enjoy, and hopefully my newest creative endeavors that I hope to really dive into in 2024 will just be as enjoyable, and I hope you can be with me on that. But we're not here to talk about myself. Rather, we're here to talk about development. Rather, character development. Over the course of the year, I've been talking about a lot of characterizations, especially about character archetypes, whether it be villains, rivals, heroes, damsels in distress, or some crazy bitches who want to take over the world while freezing Pokemon like popsicles. And I've enjoyed every second of it. This video will be a little different though. Today we'll be talking about the right and wrong way on how to make characters evolve, what shaped them, and how I believe what they've done correctly or incorrectly, especially when it comes to redeeming a character. I'm Mangakamen, and this is the right and wrong way for redemption. Spoilers for the following titles.
Say, where can I get one of these jobs?
Oh, they're everywhere.
Thanks. I'm gonna go look for one so I can stop mooching off my friends and they can get back to their lives.
So, Scott Pilgrim. Not too long ago this year, we were given Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, and don't get me wrong, I've got some issues with the series as well as its promotion, but all in all, I found it to be enjoyable. The issue I have is that there's always an oddity about the discussion of Scott Pilgrim, of the character himself, about how he's a terrible person, about how he's not a good protagonist, or one of the best ones I've seen is that he's a... Right, I can't say that on YouTube, or goodbye ad revenue, and that's fine. If you don't like the character of Scott Pilgrim, you're perfectly valid in thinking that, because Scott isn't supposed to be a likable character from the beginning. That's the point. And don't get me wrong, I've said multiple times that there's a fine line that won't be universal. Coupled with the fact that the internet tends to have a lot of surface level assumptions about fictional characters, the nuance of writing and characters gets mixed up with the worst of the worst. Still, here's a fact. Scott Pilgrim, hell, almost all the characters in the series are meant to be flawed people, and that's perfectly fine. Scott himself is a jackass at the beginning of the series, especially since you consider that the opening line to the comics and even the movie basically lays out that this 20-something-year-old man is dating a high schooler, of which he's just using said high schooler as a means for his convenience, and the moment that Scott finds the girl of his literal dreams, he just cheats on her. He's also a mooch, someone who doesn't have any actual ambition and would rather drift through life on the easiest path possible. For all intents and purposes, Scott Pilgrim could easily be the archetypical villain of another story. Scott Pilgrim isn't a good person, and that's alright. Don't get me wrong, that's a lot to swallow, and for most people, they probably wouldn't want to follow an unlikable dick through a story. It's not for everyone. But here's the thing, that's literally the point of Scott Pilgrim. Scott isn't meant to be idolized, and he sure as hell isn't meant to be emulated. Rather, it's to show that a flawed person, even as scummy as Scott Pilgrim, is capable of understanding that they're a terrible person and can work to improve themselves. It's a basic story of development, as not every protagonist can be voiceless entities that a person can emulate themselves into, or that they're the pinnacle of goodness and righteousness. If you look at Scott Pilgrim's original story, he's just a pretty shitty guy who's fighting to earn Ramona Flowers' affection. But just apply a little thought process to the story and you'll see that Scott is being confronted with his own negative tendencies, all the while becoming a person that Ramona Flowers would actually want to be with. And you can even see this when you look towards Gideon, at least in the comic version. Gideon served as a darker version of Scott, aside from Nega Scott. What I mean is, if Scott kept on the path beforehand, he could have ended up in a similar role as Gideon. Gideon Graves is even more oblivious to his own terrible behavior, becoming a monster to the point where he'll even cryogenically freeze his ex-girlfriends just so they could one day go out with him.
What a freak.
Gideon is something that Scott himself could have become eventually had he not actually developed as a character in the storyline. It's also when you look towards the movie, the growth that Scott goes through in the comics isn't exactly there, and because of that, it doesn't have the same impact as the comics, at least to me. But hey, it's a movie adaptation trying to cover several volumes of comics. You're not going to be able to stuff everything in there. Scott as a character is someone you're not supposed to like, but he's also not a character you're supposed to dislike either. He's a person that you're supposed to learn from. The point of seeing a character like Scott is to become invested in the journey and see how they can develop as a character. One thing I want to bring up is Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. Well, kinda. You see, the comics end with Scott not so much done with his development, but more so that he's become more mature and knows that he's got issues. But his development isn't exactly done. It's a nice message that just because you have development, you don't really stop evolving as a person. It's a realistic ending and even gives the possibility of things between Scott and Ramona actually working out, and
fighting those exes was the biggest mistake of our entire life.
Boom! Divorced!
or not, I guess. Now, I want to make this part clear. This isn't me saying that because Scott Pilgrim isn't the focus of Takes Off that it's a bad series. Like I said earlier in this segment, and in my video on the matter that no one actually watched, I have issues with the marketing and how it presented, but Takes Off is enjoyable for what it is. Thing is that essentially the story focuses on the other characters aside from Scott Pilgrim. Which, one thing to note, almost everyone in Scott Pilgrim is a jackass to some degree or another, so to see the idea of them actually improving upon themselves is an interesting thought process. Takes Off actually manages to show a spotlight on the other characters, showcasing that while they may still be jerks to some degree, they're not monsters either. The same can be said about Ramona Flowers, who's the focus of the series, and showcasing that her issues and fatal flaw was running away from those she cared about, and in that same vein hurting them to the point where they became evil! The thing is, one of the weaknesses of the show is that it's trying what it can to give some level of redemption to almost all the characters to some capacity. Well, say for Gideon, but hey, can't fix every jackass in the world, am I right? Wait, are his ex-girlfriends still frozen in this version of the story? Because of that, to me, the growth of every character felt like it was a bit too rushed. Maybe this is just a personal thing to me, but the moment that Ramona learned that she actually hurt Roxy for leaving her behind, Ramona's development kind of stops until the final episode, where she combines with her future self, because the lesson that she was supposed to learn already happened early in the series. There's also the motivation taken into consideration as well. I mean, if you look towards the original comics, Scott's development was because he wanted to get rid of Ramona, and he was willing to do what he could to make sure to get to that. But for Takes Off, Ramona's entire character revolves around dating people and leaving them after much more time together, which isn't that long for some examples. In the comics, it's pretty important to her character. So when she goes out of her way to face her past because one guy she barely knows is a bit flimsy to me. And to make it clear, I'm not saying the show is bad, but the pacing for the show is really rushed. And even more so when you consider that Future Scott kinda kicks the ambiguous ending that the comics had in the nuts, showing that not only was Scott's development kinda pointless in this case, but also removed the ambiguous nature of the comics ending. Now, obviously this is gonna be different for everyone. Interpretations are a thing. Some people will enjoy this, others won't. I had fun with the series, and this is merely a preference in that sort of vein. I'm not saying that the series is ruined because of this is just my perspective and how I don't really like this choice in narrative. It could also be that I'm not a really big fan of this version of time traveling storyline. Then again, I'm asking for logic in a series where people burst into coins when they get killed and you can revive yourself with an extra life. Back to the point, Scott Pilgrim certainly isn't a perfect character, but that's the point. While his redemption isn't fully over, his development was what was making him actually get to that redemption. Even after his characterization in the comics, he's still not the greatest person, but he is on the path of redemption. And I think that's admirable to some degree, especially when you're dealing with a character like Scott.
You cocky cock!
Such righteous boys, yet all is demon solid noise.
Shit, alright, if you're gonna rhyme everything, then just kill me now.
When it comes to unlikable characters and redeeming them, there are two paths you can take to make them work. You can make the more serious route of developing characters, so that way we can watch them get out of their negative character traits and become a better person. In a sense, you're redeeming the character by making them realize their mistakes and grow from them. Or you can embrace the asshole behavior and play it up for comedy or drama effect. I'm not saying it's possible not to be able to do both at the same time, but it's a bit of a tricky road to travel down, which is why we're looking at two examples that literally came out one day after another. Fred from Forspoken and Chai from Hi-Fi Rush. Hi-Fi Rush, developed by Tango Gameworks, has you follow the exploits of Chai, whose dream is to become a rock star. But due to the evil Vandelay technologies, Chai becomes a defect in getting a new mechanical arm, has to escape, and eventually comes across an evil plot to mind control people, all the while joining up with a group that helps him change. The story itself is simple, but the game's writing is charming with plenty of funny jokes peppered in.
Whoa, this is crazy. Looks like we found our AI.
This is a screensaver, Chai.
Chai doesn't really care about the situation and honestly starts off just hoping to get off the island, so he helps Peppermint and 808 with their goal of stopping Vandalake Technologies, and because of his attitude, he ignores her advice and at some point sabotages the missions that he's on. Even in the opening cutscene, we see Chai filling out an application. It showcases that he's not that great of a character. He's not smart, he's immature, and does things without actually thinking ahead. It does a good job establishing his selfish and childish behavior. But the story does its job and confronts Chai with his terrible personality traits, and when he actually begins to work alongside the rest of the cast, he comes to realize that these people he's working with are good and they're trying to do something great. And he realized that even the greatest rock star can only go so far solo. They need a good band to help cover their weaknesses. This story isn't groundbreaking, but it does a lot of hard work to showcase the development of these characters, as well as developing Chai from a jerk into a much more likable character. Which is more than I can say for Frey from Forspoken. Forspoken was developed by Luminous Productions and published by Square Enix. And unfortunately, because of this game, Luminous Productions no longer exists. In the game, we follow Frey Holland, a young woman from the streets of New York City with a rap sheet, a bad attitude, all the main character energy you could think of, and yet lacks the ability to grab a bag full of money out of a burning room.
Wait,
Gotta
look for
find
Homer.
first.
Bro, get the money.
Gotta find Homer first.
No, f that, get the money.
Gotta find Homer first.
Why would you not get the money? It's just
Gotta
right
find
there.
Homer first.
I mean, the bag of money is right there. We could do both.
You can't pick up the bag of cash?
Why even give us a prompt for this? Why? She gets transported to the fantasy world of Athia, where she discovers she has magical powers after she stole a magical cuff. And boy, is this world boring. Brown, so much endless tedium running around. While the gameplay isn't terrible, it does get tedious really quick, and the parkour isn't all that great, especially considering that most of the parkour is done in nature. And parkour is best done in, urban environments. Look, this game isn't as bad as everyone made it out to be, but that doesn't mean I have to like it. And I especially didn't really care for Frey. There's nothing wrong with an unlikable protagonist, but the moment that Frey stepped into the world of Athia, her true colors showed, and damn, they just made her extremely unlikable. That and she's kinda dumb. Then again, that was before she went to Athia. Why would you be snarky to a gang that has a gun to your face?
But for now, here's some collateral.
Here we go again!
And later in the story, it gets a bit worse. When one of the supporting characters, Auden, who goes out of her way to help people, especially Frey, even standing up to the council that wanted to put Frey to death, and even does what she can to give Frey leads on how to get back to New York, she's kinda, not treated well by Frey. And this is highlighted later in the story, where Frey complains about how Auden's father's journals, which were a lead to getting Frey back home, weren't all that helpful. However, Auden's father actually just died, and Frey's complaining about it. Not really a good look for our main character. This is also highlighted when there isn't any actual development for Frey in the story. Most of what you could call development, it really just comes out of nowhere near the end. Now, to make something clear, Frey acting selfish throughout the story is understandable. At the beginning of the game's actual gameplay section, she just wants to go home. Sure, there was a part of the story where Frey was avenging the death of a little girl, but after that, her motivations remain the same. She keeps being apathetic to the world of Athia and its inhabitants, willing to only do what she can in order to go home. And that's actually kind of fine. The problem is that the ending will try to convince you that throughout these ordeals, Frey became enamored with the people of Athia. However, that's contradicted by the previous chapter where she was willing to let the entire world burn and she didn't care. Frey does technically develop. She does become the protector of Athia, but this development doesn't come from her interactions with the world or the characters. Rather, it comes from her learning of her past, that she was the daughter of one of the major magic users of Athia, the Tanta. And then all of a sudden, Frey suddenly cares. The thing with rude characters, much like Chai or Frey, is that unless you're going to go all in and play up the rudeness or jackass behavior, you have to demonstrate how they develop as a character throughout the story, and it has to be entertaining as well. Chai's development does shine through the story of Hi-Fi Rush, and his interactions with the characters help to demonstrate that development, as Chai grows from the interactions. Meanwhile, Frey really doesn't. She grows when she learns about her origins. There's no meaningful actual connection between the characters. And that's why, to me, Forspoken isn't that great with characterization or even how to redeem a character who's a jackass.
Hi, Editor Man here. I don't know anything about Luke Fabier. I know about Cloud. I don't know anything about Luke, so, here's a thing that I made up in the spot. Please don't fire me.
Luke, I am your father.
That's not true! That's improbable!
I don't normally talk about the Tales series on this channel, which is a shame, because the Tales RPGs happen to have a lot of excellent gameplay and stories to them, especially coming back to the game since I grew up with a good number of them. Plus, hey, Tales of Symphonia managed to get a familiar voice to cast the main character.
Demon Fang! Sonic Thrust! Kids, ask your parents where babies come from!
Back in the day, that was a trip to hear that voice when I was playing Symphonia on the GameCube. Just waiting for Lloyd to say, "Titans, go!" But we're not talking about Symphonia. Instead, we're talking about Tales of the Abyss, and most notably the main character, Luc von Fabre.
Ah, shut up for a second.
Straight up, Luke is a spoiled brat at the age of 17, extremely immature and childish. Of course, there's a reason for that. 7 years before the actual story begins, Luke was kidnapped by an opposing empire, and the experience was so traumatic that it made him lose his memories. And not just the memories of his childhood, but memories of everything. The faces of his parents, and even basics of humanity like how to talk or eat. Alright, so most people who have played the game know exactly what's going on here, but I'm trying to explain this for people who haven't played the game yet, so if you guys don't mind, I'll get back to making my case. Luke will probably be one of the most annoying protagonists in gaming, and that's by design. The guy is even willing to berate and assault the mascot of the game.
Yeah, but come on, breathing fire, that'll be fun! Hey you, thing!
Luke, that's horrible.
Oh, shut up. It's fine for this little freak.
Hate!
It makes sense since he's a little kid in an adult body, and it doesn't help that he's been sheltered pretty much all his life when he was recovering from the opposing kingdom's kidnapping. Still, that only gets you so far, and as the game progresses, the party that you're with slowly gets annoyed and turned off by Luke's behavior. Even his best friend Guy, a friend who's been with him for years, gets pushed away by this behavior at one point, especially when he gets promoted into a position of power and uses that to order the party around. Now, to explain something, since it's tied into the game's lore, basically, there's a power called phonons and hyperresonance. The former is essentially what makes up the elements that comprises the world in Tales of the Abyss. They're basically the building blocks of the world, to put it as simply as possible, kind of like our molecules and atoms in ours. Hyperresonance, in turn, to make it really simple, can create and destroy matter or causes other events to happen. One such example is when Luke and another character, Tyr, come across each other at the beginning of the story and basically blows them to another portion of the world, which triggers the plot of the game. Luke is capable of activating this event on his own, and if improperly used, it can cause some great damage. It's even said in the game that if it's used wrong, it can actually destroy the atmosphere of the entire planet. Gee, wouldn't it be a bad thing if this mentally immature brat was being used by someone he trusted to use his power to cause a tragedy? That would be so well, shit! Yeah, as it turns out, one of the only people that Luke actually trusted in his life, Juan Van Grant, who was manipulating him into thinking that he was going to save a town called Axariuth, but instead completely destroyed it. As you would imagine, someone with Luke's mental faculties and maturity would constantly deny that any fault he actually had, even throwing tantrums yelling, "It's not my fault," which is what ultimately forces the rest of the party to get away from him.
It's not my fault! Master Van said... Yeah, Master Van told me to do it. It's not my fault. It's not my fault!
I'm returning to the bridge. If I stay here, I'll just be irritated by some ridiculous ranting.
Ever since you lost your memory, you're like a completely different person.
You all couldn't do anything to stop it either. Don't just blame me.
You're right. I'm powerless. But still. Ion, don't even bother talking to him. He's not worth it.
It's Master Van's fault, not mine. Right, Guy?
Luke, don't make me think even less of you.
I was stupid for starting to think you had some good in you.
Why? Why are you all blaming me?
Master, cheer up!
Shut up! What do you know?
A lot of my people died because of me. So, I can understand what you're feeling, Master.
Don't compare me to you! Don't compare me to...
It's really understandable, because Luke was the cause of countless lives being lost, and to make it worse, the only reason why he did it was because his Master Van told him to do it, and that would make him a hero. He thought of doing good for selfish reasons, and it cost him dearly. To top things off, Luke's identity is fake. You see, he doesn't have amnesia, because he didn't actually exist 7 years prior to the plot of the game. He was a clone created by Master Van, merely to be used as a tool, and it isn't long after the destruction of Exariuth that he's told this information, and even confronted by the original Luke.
Why do you think you and I have the same face? How should I know? I'm a noble who was born in Batical. 7 years ago, I was kidnapped by a villain named Van. You can't mean... That's right. You're a second-rate copy of me. A mere replica.
It's here I have to explain something. This is a pivotal point of character development, especially for a character like Luke. From what I've described, I've talked about a character, while having a lot of negatives to him, you shouldn't want to play as this character. You don't want to be this person. And while that runs the risk of alienating a part of your audience, it's at this point that Luke understands something about himself.
With this, I say goodbye to who I have been.
And as such, as a symbol of his first step of change, Luke cuts his long hair off. And in the rest of the game, we watch as Luke changes as an actual person, saying goodbye to the person he was, hoping to become a better one and earn the trust of his friends that he lost. And the game shows this. Throughout the rest of the game, Luke does his best to become a more humble person, trying his best to help however he can in the world's plot. I'm not going to go too far deep into this video, since you can consider this to be a recommendation to get your hands on this fun RPG, although considering that the last way to get your hands on this was via the 3DS, that might be easier said than done. Luke's development actually reminds me of Cloud Strife from Final Fantasy VII's fame, a protagonist who starts off rather aloof and trying to be cooler than he actually is, acting like he doesn't care for the cause of saving the planet with Avalanche, but not only is his demeanor a falsehood, like Luke, his persona of being a first-class soldier is fake. It belongs to a man named Zack, someone who not only managed to accomplish what Cloud's dream was to become a first-class soldier and work alongside his hero Sephiroth.
Me? Gungaga.
After the Nibelheim incident, where Cloud's home was burnt to ashes, his family was killed, and the last person in his life, Tifa, was almost taken from him as well, he and Zack were exposed to experimentation by the mastermind of the game, Hojo. And when the two managed to escape, Cloud was traumatized and adopted Zack's identity when the black-haired soldier was killed in front of him. It had ingrained into Cloud's psyche, and didn't exactly make him out to be the best person, since he was practically doing a pseudo-impersonation. And unfortunately, because of this situation, Cloud made everything worse and worse, losing a close ally, and then giving Sephiroth the black materia that would doom the world. After rediscovering himself, though, Cloud begins to change and become a stronger person for it. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Protagonists like this aren't bad. They're flawed. But because of those flaws, we want to see them improve, even if they cause things like the end of the world or death and destruction, because redemption isn't out of their grasp. It just takes a lot of hard work to do it, and that's something you have to consider when you get a protagonist like this. This week's been taking a lot of time looking at protagonists of the stories, and there's a reason for that. For a character like Scott Pilgrim, he's a terrible person who you want to see improve as a character, grow from his mistakes, and confront his terrible behavior. That's more of a passive media in that regard when talking about a protagonist. Then you've got the more active media where you're in control of characters I've brought up in this video. They're protagonists, and while it's not impossible to play as an unlikable character, that's more dependent if they can evolve, and if they do, it has to be done in a more natural way where the elements of the story interacting with the cast. Because that's what really counts when it comes to development, at least for me. It has to come naturally. Because as ourselves as people interact with others, we take away those elements of interactions and incorporate them into ourselves to improve. Consequently, the same can be viewed in a more toxic relationship where degradation can occur to someone's personality. That can be just as entertaining in media viewing sense, but dangerous in real life. But that's not the point I'm making. Rather, when we see interactions between characters, there are times that we want to see good influence affect someone who is effectively a bad guy. And that's where we come into this. When it comes to villains and redemption, you got yourself a bit of a minefield here. You don't want the redemption to come too easy, but you also don't want it to come out of lecturing to either the characters or the audience. Thus, Mr. 2. Bon Clay, or Bon Clay, or Bentham. For the sake of the video, I'm just going with Bon Clay. One Piece is probably one of the more interesting series when you talk about villains to some degree, because it plays with the typical archetypes of villains and heroes, including the main characters of the Straw Hat Pirates, who, if the name didn't give it away, are pirates who do illegal things and break all sorts of laws. yet somehow they become heroes regardless of what Luffy wants to do. To make things simple, Bon Curé was a part of the Baroque Works, an organization that was aiming to overthrow the reigning royal family of the country of Arabasta, with Bon Curé being used to impersonate the king of the nation and throw it into a scandal so a war would happen, and to make things easier again, to take over the country and allow the big bad of the arc, Crocodile, to get an ancient weapon. The Straw Hat crew are helping their friend Vivi, the prince of the country, to prevent the war from happening. Look, I know that's a real condensed and generalized explanation of the arc in One Piece, of all things, but it's necessary since this video isn't solely about One Piece. You just need this background for me to talk about Bon's redemption. Funnily enough, the first time that Bon met the Straw Pirates, the situation wasn't antagonistic. In fact, it was rather uplifting and comical. There was a genuine friendship being made between Bon and the Straw Hats. Well, a good number of them at least. It also helps that the Straw Hats did help Bon, because if they didn't, well, he'd probably be sleeping with the fishes. It wouldn't be long, though, that the truth of both parties would be revealed. It would be after Bon and the Straw Hats have separated after initial that both parties realized that they were enemies, with Bon revealing that he had his Devil ability to copy Vivi's father's likeness, and Bon being shown that the Straw Hats were now targets of Baroque Works for interfering with their plans. When the two parties would meet again, it would be as enemies. Although to be frank, Bon was facing off against Sanji, who was busy and didn't have his likeness taken by Bon, which works because there is a connection between these two combatants. But Bon had already did the damage with his Devil Fruit powers to impersonate Vivi's father and set off the war. For all intents and purposes, Bon was a villain to the Straw Hats, but the time that he has spent with the Straw Hats had sparked a genuine friendship. It's why when the Navy had appeared to take the Straw Hats into custody, Bon actually tricked the Navy into chasing after him, because he actually managed to establish a meaningful bond with the Straw Hats. Even though the time was short, it still showed that there were good hearts between the parties. It wouldn't be until later in the Impel Down arc where Straw Hat Luffy would run across Bon again, while Luffy was on a quest to save his brother Ace from execution. Bon helps Luffy to get through the many levels of the prison, and through their hardships, Luffy and Bon's friendship continues to grow. And even after Luffy almost dies in the prison, Bon is willing to do whatever he can to save his friend. And after Luffy recovers and the escape from the prison takes place, Bon sacrifices himself so Luffy and the other escapees can safely be freed from the hell on Earth. Now the reason I bring this up is because even the smallest of meanings and interactions can set a character on the right path for redemption. Because if you think about it, Bon was willing to sacrifice everything multiple times for Luffy, mainly because while Bon was a bad guy, he still had conviction in his own ways. When you really think about it, the best part of redemption stories is to see that people like Bon, who have done bad things in his life, were willing to do whatever they could for the people they considered friends. It really gives a humanizing element to the character, because while there may be terrible people in the world, they're still human, and deep down, don't we all want to be great people? Don't we all want to be good guys? It's simple, but it shows that even one event can have an effect on a person and have them do selfless deeds for those they care about. Plus, hey, Bon Curé is just one of those characters who's amazing in so many ways. Such a fabulous man. Swans will never die.
Well, folks, it's time to call a night. Do what you feel and keep both feet on the wheel. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.
There are a lot more ways to do redemption. That's because the idea of redemption is more of a nebulous aspect, especially when it comes to main characters and villains. Part of the reason why I focus mostly on protagonists of this video is because it's easier to redeem a villain, especially in modern day media, since it's a bit of a trend to make the bad guys a lot more sympathetic, and there isn't anything wrong with that, but it really leads to who's the real villain here. Redemption can be a powerful tool with villainous characters, but we also can't forget that part of the reason that we really resonate with characters who aren't the greatest of people is because we want to see them grow. So when you look at someone like Scott Pilgrim or Chai, characters who aren't the best people around, and you can see them development over the course of the story, and that development comes from not only the challenges they face, but from also interacting with the rest of the cast, it sparks something within people. When the development of our characters just comes from them learning of their past or seeing their future, it doesn't really feel all that enthralling. It just makes the journey hollow, because what would be the point of this journey if the information was there all the time? I'm sure there are those who will disagree with me on this, and that's perfectly fine. Most of these types of videos tend to be opinionated. I mean, nowhere do I say anything on my channel is a fact unless it's otherwise stated, like talking about mechanics of games or factual events in media or in the world. Interpretation is something that is opinionated though, but you get the point. If you don't think that characters like Scott Pilgrim are worth the journey, that's perfectly fine. Sometimes a protagonist's redemption is a tall order depending on how much of a jerk or idiot or jackass they are at the beginning of a story. Personally speaking, I don't mind that at all. Sometimes even a character who has done some of the most horrible things can be somewhat redeemed. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, obviously, but redemption is going to be a highly subjective thing, and so is the character. For years, people considered Scott Pilgrim to be a terrible guy, even to the point of labeling him as a villain. Now, I disagree that he's a villain, but is he a terrible person? Yeah, totally, he is. At least at the beginning of his story. It'll be a tall order, but that's the point of redemption stories, that we take the not so great of people and we see them improve. Because deep down, we as humans want to keep evolving in some way or another. Even I want to improve as a YouTuber going forward, and that's why I've got myself a new look. I hope you guys enjoyed, because this mug's going to be the face of the channel going forward. So I want to thank you guys for everything in 2023, and I hope this video is at the start of a great 2024. As such, please show some love by liking the video, leaving a comment if you haven't yet. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It's all free and it helps out more than you know. Or if you do want to help me monetarily, I do have channel memberships on, and I do have my Patreon and Ko-Fi available down below. Thanks again. I'm Manga-Kamen, and remember my friends, examine your fandom. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.